Thank you for joining Restorative Justice for All's 5th annual conference focused on addressing and preventing violent radicalization and extremism. I would like to welcome you all. My name is Alexander Sievers. I'm a senior practitioner in PCVE at the Violence Prevention Network in Germany and program director of INDEX, the International Network of Disengagement and Exit. I design and deliver trainings, develop intervention tools for tertiary prevention and disengagement work. My practice focuses on biography-centered, trauma-informed approaches and building international practitioner networks to support safe reintegration and to better network practitioners internationally. Today, we will examine restorative justice in the context of violent radicalization and extremism. Restorative Justice for All takes a broad view of restorative justice as an ethos and a practical approach to address conflict beyond narrow criminal justice outcomes. This vital session on addressing and preventing violent radicalization and extremism takes place at a time when polarization and extremist narratives are fueling new conflicts and narratives. So this conversation, I think we all can agree on, is more than urgent. Restorative Justice for All International Institute has been at the forefront for this work since its founding, and therefore we are honored to welcome Dr. Theo Gavrielides, who is the founder and director of Restorative Justice for All. Theo was recently, or is now, publishing a powerful new monograph titled Addressing Violent Radicalization and Extremism, a restorative justice and psychological approach, which presents the findings of restorative justice at all international and local pilot programs.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you everybody who joined. It's my pleasure. I'm the one who should be grateful. And I guess it's a bit of a difficult one. I was kind of struggling over the weekend what to say today, because how much can you say in such a short period of time when you're working on a topic for 10 years? I chose to start with personal reflections and my philosophical approach to the issue of violent radicalization and hate and terrorism. You can see Themis, it's the goddess of justice, holding the scales of justice and the sword that she uses to implement justice. And it's not logical to have on both scales the same thing. So you can't fix harm with harm. And then my personal ambition, being in the justice field for some time, is just like, why do we always judge the justice system or whether we are just or not? How many people we put in prison, or how many terrorists we capture and kill or punish, and not how much we fix and how much we heal and how much we restore and repair. And that's never been the critical factor that we measure success. That's how my initial journey for this project and this book started. We'll go to the next slide. So that kind of created a bit of resistance in me, and kind of saying, how free are we when we choose what to do to honor justice? Are we just silently accepting this kind of silent slave-master relationship that we've been told to follow? And if we are waking up and it's just a habit, then what is the alternative? Is there another type of punishment? Is there another way to communicate to the wrongdoer that we have been harmed and maybe get a better response and a better reaction? So next slide. So this is where I realize myself that when I do come to a point of realization, then there is resistance. And when there is resistance, there is radicalization. And through radicalization, there is change. And this is why I have a problem with the word radicalization, because it's been used, including European funding bodies and the European Commission, incorrectly, in my view. Radicalization is not a bad thing. I think is what made human rights activists and young people to come forth to, change colonization to freed countries and to liberate. It's violent radicalization I think we should be condemning and stopping. I think radicalized ideas and waking up from this silent sleep of accepting is not a bad thing. In fact, that's what I think organizations like the one that I set up, standing for peace, should be doing, is to be radical. And I get excited when I see young people being radical and coming up with ideas to change the status quo. The opposite is apathy. So if we just stay apathetic and we just accept the status quo, I think things were not going to change. And the big, I think, contribution that I'm trying to make with my work and with the organization I set up is to connect all these concepts with the power concept and how that is used and exercised for the good and the bad. So it's this apathy and this kind of acceptance that I want to change through the work that we're doing, and I welcome your views. I know I'm starting with a very controversial point for discussion, but I'm consciously doing that before I go into the more practical side of things, because I want to put things in context. And this is also what I'm experiencing today. And as you said, Alexander, we are kind of going through a normalization of hate language, where even like leaders, and I'm not going to name any specific politician, I think you all know who it is in Europe or in America and so on, who use this narrative, which I call the them and I narrative, to exercise certain fears that then the consequence of that fear is to create a feeling of insecurity. What is the opposite, and what do we need to do apart from kind of moaning and identifying the problem? You know, how do we create the hope that I'm sure is out there? And with this realization that there is a problem in the language and in the context and how we are being told what to do and what to avoid and repeat ourselves, I also saw, you know, kind of a responsibility in me and in the work that we do, and felt almost like a bit of shame, because I saw that the problem actually that we're facing in terms of hate, terrorism, radicalization is actually our problem, and we are the terrorists. We need to start with our own responsibilities and how we treat each other and what we teach our children or what we say and how we behave, and that prevention is not possible without starting with ourselves and accepting that responsibility that we first have. So before we judge anyone, we first need to judge what we're doing and being self-reflective. And that's why I'm excited to have this conversation with you today, to see how you feel about this approach, which then will materialize into specific tools that we have been developing to create that hope within each individual. So here are the kind of three objectives of the book and of the kind of contribution that we have at RJ for All, which reflects a multi-year program that we've been doing, and is to introduce this kind of more positive approach to rehabilitation and reduction of recidivism that doesn't follow the path of the traditional criminal justice system, and that is encapsulated in the RJiNEAR model that you're going to hear about very soon. And it is a resilience model that we have been piloting using positive psychology, or positive criminology, and restorative justice. The second objective is to connect what is happening in the violent radicalization and extremist field with the issue of power and power abuse. And this is where things will get a little bit controversial and maybe heated, because it is about challenging the status quo of the powerful. But then at the same time, what you're going to hear from me in a minute is that power is also something very positive. It's not just something that is negative. It can also create the hope and the tools to address the power abuse. And I just want to stay a little bit on power. And I published another book on power, which is called Race, Power and Restorative Justice. It's on the screen. If you want to read about that, and it's kind of more focused about power and how it has been used in different contexts, but particularly within the race field. But as I say, power is not an individual property, and I am not a believer of biological or psychological traits. It's a choice, it's a decision. It's a place where we found ourselves having used our moral compass, and it's influenced by what surrounds us. So it comes down to who we are as individuals. And that narrative, that value system is informed by all sorts of things, whether it's our parents, our families, our culture, our surroundings, our friends, and how we treat others and how we're being treated. And as I said, yes, it can be the architect of terror, but it can also be what brings us together. And this is the counter side of power as a powerful tool to bring the solutions or prevent. And it's in this concept of human relationships. And that's why I put a lot of significance, and this is where restorative justice comes in, of the powerful effect that what I call social liaison creates, what it is in existence. So if there is connection between individuals or between communities or between states or nations, then that is the best preventative approach that we can have against terrorist and hate activities and the feelings that lead to frustration or extremist acts and for hurting each other. And that's where my kind of basis in terms of punishment and prevention is found, in this particular element of power. And where restorative justice comes in, as you will hear, and where the model comes in, is to fix when this relationship is broken. So when the social liaison is broken, restorative justice comes in with its practices to repair where it can, or at the preventative state, where it creates all these elements and this cohesion between you and I, or between communities, so that we don't get to a stage where hate feelings and misunderstandings take place. And in order to do that, it uses dialogue as a method. We speak. We don't speak. And there are various ways to speak, where there is language, all sorts of different forms of speech, a hug, anything. That is a method of communication. And that might not be in a narrow sense restorative justice, but it is dialogue. It is those values that brings us together. And one of the key principles of restorative justice, which I keep bringing into my writings, is power sharing. Without power sharing, there is no restorative justice. There is no dialogue. We're just exercising power and we're imposing our positions. And while we do that, and while we listen to each other to fix a relationship, then we get to realize, and if anyone has experience of restorative justice, that we start feeling certain things very strongly. You know, feelings of, I shouldn't have done that, or, oh, I am getting it now. Oh, I'm asking, why did you target me? And those feelings create very strong urges for coming closer and fixing what has been done. And that is a different form of pain. It's not the pain that you experience when you are in prison. It's a very personal type of pain where, if you let it grow, will lead to transformation, is what I call catharsis. And I will come back to that in a minute in terms of its contribution for repairing, but also rehabilitating and having a more constructive way in terms of going forward and repairing. But it does require this self-realization. So yeah, here I use kind of an analogy of, again, as I said, Greek tragedy. If you had the chance to see Antigone, for instance, the purpose is to create this kind of strong feelings within the spectators, so that as they are watching, they go through this painful process of, you know, being in the shoes of the actors, of Antigone, of anyone who's experiencing that pain, and then kind of sympathizing with their position. But then through that, the cleansing comes in, and catharsis means cleansing. And that is a different kind of shape of pain. What you end up getting by the end of the play is a transformation and a cleansing through that process. And that's why this kind of emotional purification, if you like, or moral education through this process matters for the outcome. This is not something that the criminal justice system does. You're not going to be able to have those conversations and experience this transformation through imprisonment or, custodial sentences and the kind of one-way street approach that we have. And I'm not saying, and I've always said this in my writing, I'm not an abolitionist. I'm not for an either-or situation. This is a complementary method that works when it works, but it doesn't always work. Why? Because to have catharsis and to enter into that process, you need to have voluntariness, you need to want it, and you need to be prepared, and the practice needs to be correct. The facilitation needs to be correct. Otherwise, you are risking quite a lot, actually, to opening the Pandora box and having re-victimization, all sorts of unpleasant consequences. So voluntariness and good preparation are very, very important to achieve this outcome, which is why it's not for everybody. Next slide. So here's the model now. We're going now from, I promise you, this was my kind of philosophical bit. So I'll pause for now. And then I'm just going to go to the more practical stuff and how does all that translate into actual tools. So we came up with this psychosocial model, and RJiNEAR stands for Restorative Justice. I is myself, knowledge, emotional intelligence, awareness, and responding with growth. And each of those letters, and if you go to the next slide, corresponds to a psychosocial domain or a resilience domain. Yeah, Rita, you can go to the next one. These are the domains which we have been piloting both in different contexts. So we have seen those indicators as important indicators, not just for young people, so within schools and educational institutions, but also for adults. So in prisons, youth offending institutions, migration centers, universities, we tested this and we came up with this 5 domains of resilience. And you can see the first one is positive identity. So developing the positive identity within individuals, emotional intelligence and relational competence, being able to relate. So things like empathy, ideological flexibility, and this social liaison that I talked about, the connection between us, citizenship, education, for example, and so on. The 4th one is responding with resilience, which has 2 elements, the existential ethics. So things like tolerance, skills that we have to be able to adapt to other people's cultural circumstances or environments and all of those things, growth and well-being. And the final one is the restorative justice ethos with the principles of power sharing, the social liaison, and pain as a reconstruction. So these are the psychosocial domains that this model has. And then through that, we go to the next slide, we created 3 different types of activities that then teach those psychosocial domains to the target groups, or develop those skills within the target group. And there's a combination of 3 different things that have history in the literature to have worked. One is through cognitive learning, and we do that through workshops, and I'll come back in a minute. The second one is art, or what I call restorative justice art. And that can be, we've tried almost all types of art, theatre, music, painting, digital printing, anything that works for the particular target group. And then the other one is sports. No surprise there. Again, sports bring people together. And when all of these 3 things are combined, then they deliver those 5 psychosocial domains to the target group. The workshops have 8 lessons. They're up on the screen, and each lesson reflects the domain. It's important when those lessons are delivered to the target group that they're combined with an art workshop and a sports session. And this is where we piloted the model. It's these countries here that you can see up on the screen. As I said, it's been an 8-year journey, and this is just the implementation of the case studies. So they stretch from really big 3-year programs to 2 years and then 1 year, and then the kind of community-based work that we're doing at the center. They're the case studies in the book, so you can have a chance to read. These are some of the results that we got in terms of recidivism and resilience. As I said, the implementing environments were adult prisons and youth offending institutions, schools, universities, and online extremism and violent radicalization. Each case study had also control groups. So it was randomized trials that we did. So these are some of the things that we observed in kind of collectively. Obviously, the devil is in the detail, but this is kind of a snapshot because I'm conscious of time. So we saw an improved recidivism in terms of those who were already in institutions. And now I'm reminding you, we looked at both adult prisons, but also youth offending institutions. Again, you won't be surprised that when it came to the young offenders, the recidivism rates with intervention were higher than in the adults. There was better results again. And improved resilience in terms of the psychosocial domains that I mentioned before. So all of those domains were positively recorded as improved. Because the projects ran out between 2 to 3 years, we weren't able to see beyond those timescales. So in an ideal world, I would have loved to have a 10-year pilot, but obviously these were funded projects and they were time-bound. But as I said before, and one of the points for this conference is to continue this work. And we would like to hear from as many of you to see if you have similar work or you'd be interested in doing partnership bits with us for a Horizon program or to follow up. As I said, this is a multi-year program that we have at RJ for All. The final thing that's just to mention, because, you know, restorative justice is not just about the harming party, it's also about community and the harmed party. For the first time, when it comes to these sort of cases, we also saw improved victim and community satisfaction. So we were also involving those who were involved in the harm, whether it was their family, them, or their community, to get their feedback in terms of what was happening and the intervention. Yeah, next slide. So wrapping up, so I know I said quite a lot and you're probably scratching your head. Just keep the highlights that, you know, with the narrative with the media recently, radicalization, all these words, hate speech, hate crime, they're just everywhere. And I think it's good to have this debate, but how they're being used, I feel that creates some sort of defeatism within us, to give up and accept what is being said to us, and that we are living in a kind of doom and gloom situation where, you know, we just need to just go along with it, accept the them and us narrative and endorse it, and fear alongside all those, whether it's financial fear, security fear, nationalistic fears, and just endorse the status quo. And I think that's where probably I'll get challenged for challenging that. And it's not about conspiracy theories, but I do feel that by creating fear, you maintain a status quo. And the powerful want us to keep that status quo is when we have realization that there is resistance and radicalization is a good thing. And power abuse, as I said, is the most hidden and sophisticated, long-lasting architect of terror. But at the same time is what can bring people together and generate hope. And it's that potential power that we can tap into and the humanity that we have to bring us together to then create prevention and a process of repair that brings people humanity out as opposed to an adversarial resistance kind of attitude. And if you tap into this existing social liaison that we all have, we all connected, and work on that, then we have an alternative positive way forward. How we do that, next slide. As I said, we articulated this in the RJiNEAR model as a kind of intervention model for prevention, but also control. And then all the other stuff that we want to do at RJ for All, and we started doing. And this is where I kind of want to bring awareness of initiatives that we have started, and we will encourage you to join. such as the International Restorative Justice Pledge, to sign up to this pledge. Restorative Justice for All, by the way, stands for what it says on the team. We're trying to do restorative justice for all. We're trying to keep everything free. We ask just people to donate if they want to. So pledge is free to join. Membership is free to join. You know, all of that stuff is free to sign up to. And if you can support, great. If you can't, then that's great too. But without coming together, and we feel that that's our role as an International Restorative Justice Institute, is to bring people together. And I believe through the restorative justice methods, whether it's direct or indirect, we can do that.
And Theo, thank you very much for this interesting insights into your work and for your new book. I mean, it's truly inspiring and exciting. And especially your point about what radicalization is it good, evil, even necessary sometimes, or something we need to take care of? And while that, of course, language is one of the main objectives with radicalization and extremism, and as language is changing and constantly developing, I think so the role of restorative justice seems like a very important one when we want to target extremism. First, the introduction round of the panelists starting. And now I would like to welcome Professor Grazia Mannozzi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I warmly greet all the participants. And I want to thank Professor Gavrielides and his team for both organizing this event and for kindly inviting me to join. Alexander, I'm Professor of Criminal Law and Restorative Justice at the University of Insubria, which is a small young university close to Switzerland in Como. I teach criminal law, restorative justice, and victim offender mediation, and also transitional justice. And I also direct the Center for Restorative Justice and Mediation, which I founded with a group of colleagues in 2014 to promote research, training, and dialogue among scholars, practitioners, and institution. I should add institution. Short presentation, what I can add. Through my academic life, restorative justice is a sort of fil rouge of my work. It has guided my research and teaching, not only as a topic of study, but as a way to rethink and meaning the purposes of criminal law. To be honest, I must admit that being trained in restorative justice and later training students or mediators in restorative justice has also changed me as a person. It has transformed the way I relate to my colleagues, to the students, and also the way I teach. And I truly believe that Howard Zerr is right when he says that restorative justice is a way of life. Over the time, I have explored other fields, sentencing system, corporate liability, and bribery and corruption. But in all these fields, restorative justice has remained one of my key perspectives. In recent years, I also turned my attention to the relationship between law and language. I'm interested in how legal words shape the way we think and feel about justice. And this perspective is very useful for me. It was useful also in exploring this very interesting book. During the last 10 years, I had the privilege to serve in several national legislative commissions, including the one that drafted the Italian first comprehensive legislation, legal framework on restorative justice enacted in 2022. I think that reform marked a real turning point. For a long time, restorative justice, at least in Italy, was seen with skepticism, something marginal, maybe too idealistic, maybe utopian. But today, restorative justice is part of our criminal justice system. And it may be a cornerstone to explore restorative justice as a device to face very complex situations like radicalization and extremism. For me, contributing to that reform was both a professional and a personal milestone. It gave legal form to what was a deep conviction. Justice might include listening, recognition, dialogue, and as Professor Gavrielides said, must include hope. I can add only one more thing. More recently, with two academics and a judge, I founded a new interdisciplinary journal called, in Italian, Cura e Giustizia. It means care and justice, or healing and justice. And its name expresses our goal to bring care into justice and to bring justice into care. And I also very pleased to anticipate that in the next issue of that journal, in the next issue, will include a review to Theo Gavrielides' new book, written by Alice Angelini. So Theo, you can see this review in our Italian brand new journal. Thank you very much. Short presentation, what I can add. Through my academic life, restorative justice is a sort of fil rouge of my work. It has guided my research and teaching, not only as a topic of study, but as a way to rethink and meaning the purposes of criminal law. To be honest, I must admit that being trained in restorative justice and later training students or mediators in restorative justice has also changed me as a person. It has transformed the way I relate to my colleagues, to the students, and also the way I teach. And I truly believe that
Thank you, Grazia, and also for this truly very inspiring piece of work. And I also did like a lot what you said, that restorative justice, while teaching it, it also changed your life and how you interact with colleagues or other individuals. So thank you very much. And next we do have Professor Navid Hansen. He's a professor of security at the University College of the Norwegian Correctional Services and Associate Professor of OsloMet, and he's bringing expertise on corrections and security. David, please be so kind now, introduce yourself and your work and your expectations of today's panel, and maybe a word to the subsequent discussion we're going to have.
Okay, thanks a lot. So, as you said, I work for the Correctional Service, where I've conducted years of in-depth studies focusing on Islam in prisons, as well as the issue of radicalization in prisons. And I have always wondered, or from the beginning, I always wondered what everybody meant, that we do it the best way and Norway is the best in correctional service, etc. But there, at the same time, I was always thinking that something is lacking here, because I would always experience inmates, prisoners, talking about their crime to me and say that they would really like to talk about this in an organized manner and to potentially also meet their victims. We do have certain focus on restorative justice, but in the prisons it's not that common. It's very uncommon, actually. Although we have a good community experience with it. Nils Christie in 1976, he made up this whole doctrine. They use it a lot for alternative punishment for younger persons, like juvenile, not incarceration, but punishment, in cooperation with the National Mediation Service. But again, the prison service do not work on that specifically. We did get in the last year's action plan on working with radicalization and violent extremism. It was posed as some of the things that we were going to do starting last year, but we haven't done anything about it yet. That being said, as most of you may probably know, we do work very holistically, and we have a lot of generic content, and our way of looking at sentencing and rehabilitation, not least, has a lot of the components that Theo talked about earlier today. So we implement a lot of the psychosocial domains and the practical activities. They are embedded within the way we work. So we build that resilience, and we see a lot of the effects of it regardless. At this stage, I really want to talk about, or to tell you a story actually about one inmate I met some years ago that came to my attention because he was a convert into Islam, supposedly, and he was flagged for being probably radical. So this was a guy that his family background was from a country in Asia, and he had been sent here to Norway to commit a very, very violent act of violence, or a very, very brutal act of violence. He was sent here actually to kill a guy, and he killed that guy, a very young man, in Oslo, and he was sentenced to around 12 years in prison. When I met him, he had served something like 7-8 years, mostly in high security facilities. He was still a criminal, to be precise. He was doing drugs, he was selling drugs, he was intimidating people, staff, other inmates. He was not doing a lot of productive things. And at some stage, suddenly he changed everything. He stopped having positive urine tests for drugs. He stopped fighting with everybody, and you could see this in his records as well. He just, overnight, he changed. And during some time, I got into the position where I could ask him, and I said that, so what happened? I was thinking that it might have something to do with the conversion into religion or into Islam, but it turns out it was not part of that story at all. I used a lot of time with him. I went skiing with him in the mountain areas where the prison is, and I spent a lot of time during daytime with him. He had half his days at this stage going to school, reading up on everything he could find about Al-Qaeda, ISIS, war, something like that. So again, we were not sure what to think about this guy. He was sort of like bewildered. And his crimes had taken quite a toll on his psyche. His drugs abuse was coming out of control, or had come out of control, and he was constantly thinking about going back to the moment where he killed that young man some years previously. Young man from Oslo, brutally murdered downtown. He had talked about this with his aunt, who lived in a country in Asia. And at a certain stage, or a certain time, where his aunt had gone to a temple to offer her prayers, and she was sitting at the altar, lighting a candle, burning that candle, and then she started talking to the woman sitting next to her. And the other woman said that, I am burning this for my son. He was killed a few years ago. He was living in Oslo. He was killed by a guy that was sent there. Then his aunt, sitting next to this woman, said that, I am burning this candle for my nephew. He is in Oslo, or not in Oslo, but he's in Norway, serving a sentence for a person, a young man he killed some years ago. It turned out it was the same guy. Turned out this aunt of the inmate I talked about had actually met the mother of his victim. So after that, the aunt called her nephew, the inmate here, and told the story. And that was for this inmate turned out to be a cognitive change for him. He immediately stopped doing all this bad stuff. He immediately stopped doing all he was doing in terms of crime, etc. He was steadily set on trying to get things restorative in a restorative manner for the mother, for the family, etc. And he was trying to seek forgiveness. He was trying to desperately trying to get the prison to contact her, because she was living not that far away from the prison. The prison didn't understand it. They didn't understand the issue. They said that that would only be very bad for her, and you don't want to re-victimize her, etc. So he found a way anyway to contact her. He spoke to her, and she said, "I have forgiven you. I have totally forgiven you. You are not my son now." So this was a few minutes of a very strange story, which made a huge impact on me. That you could actually you could do something about this. You could put it into system. You could put it into order. This inmate, he left Norway a few years ago. Just last week, I went back to the prison where I used to visit him, and turns out he's mailing his former guards, telling them that he is fine. He's crime-free now. He's having a good life. He changed all the negativity in his life. He gets to sleep now. He's not thinking about that very tragic incident many years ago now, actually. So that is, from my perspective, it's a nice way of thinking about restorative justice, although it was not put into like an organized thing. Yeah, I will stop at that.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for that, I think, very interesting story. And indeed, reintegration, I do believe, only comes through reflection, also understanding of your own past, and also the intrinsic motivation of change. So we need to provide this for sure, especially in prisons, if we really want to, make really people change, especially if you didn't learn it. We have to provide the spaces. So, but now also let's go to our last panelist, Professor Gemma Varona. She is the director of the Basque Institute of Criminology and coordinator of the Restorative Justice Theory at the Institute. Dear Gemma, perhaps you can also tell us shortly about your work and maybe what you hope to gain from today's event.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you to Theo, and thank you to my colleagues and all the organizers and the persons who are so kind to be here today. Well, I will be very short. I developed my PhD. I come from law, and later I specialized in criminology and sociology of law. And I defended my PhD on restorative justice back in 1997, quite old now. And for me, life has brought me this joy of living enough for the moment to realize how the practice and legislation of restorative justice has changed. In the world, I also collaborate with the European Forum for Restorative Justice, so I can compare also in the work of other colleagues like Theo and others, and in my own country, 30 years, to analyze that when I defended my PhD, everything was about the limits. What are the limitations of restorative justice? Should be restricted to juveniles, should be restricted to minor crimes. What are minor crimes? And then evidence and practice show us, not only in Spain, but in all countries, that there are no limitation in the sense that usually we think legal scholars, like saying for what kind of crimes, for what kind of profiles of offenders or victims. I also like to say that I have the honor nowadays to be the president of the World Society of Victimology. And this is a very important change too. In the last symposia of the World Society of Victimology, restorative justice is a key topic. And this was not in the origins of the restorative justice movement, particularly in that mythical point of the Kitchener experiment in Ontario, Canada. But nowadays, we have victims who really want to participate, and particularly in hate crimes, and particularly in also violent, extremist, and radicalized behaviors. And this was an unwritten story also or unexpected, if I may, story or development for restorative justice. And it shows us how restorative justice somehow, and the practice of restorative justice, questions our own assumptions about what victims are, what victims want, and how we can repair. It also shows us that somehow we have to break those links between reparation and prevention. If I can, I will explain later. And basically, that's what I want to say. I will just click in the chat where people can find publications in English of the Restorative Justice Theory and Practice Lab. There we study and we intervene. So that's why we call ourselves a lab. And I think that will be all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you also for this. And I think, again, we could hear that not just your work, but also the work of the other panelists is driven by values. I would start with the first question, and maybe also addressing it first to Theo again. How do you define restorative justice in the context of violent radicalization and extremist harms?
A little bit of an obsession to define restorative justice, and I get it. And there's probably more definitions on restorative justice than any other criminological concept. What the consensus was, which is why I keep using this word, is the word ethos in terms of how we conduct ourselves, and that puts at the front the moral side of restorative justice as opposed to the practical side of restorative justice. Then, of course, as a lawyer, I sympathize with narrowing it down, especially when it comes to diverting a case from the criminal justice system. So if we are going to talk about the kind of the narrow understanding of restorative justice, is the direct practice of victim offender mediation, family group conferencing and circles, and then the indirect way of videos, apologies, letters, and all sorts of indirect ways of communication. As long as there is a rapport and an encounter between the parties, then the main element of communication will be there. Then what inspires through that dialogue is the values, is the ethos, is what will keep the conversation going. And that ethos is power sharing, quality, dignity, respect, involvement in decision making. Without those, you won't have restorative justice, including the willingness to participate in restorative justice, which is why the word voluntariness is very, very important.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. Highly interesting. But let's hear maybe, Grazia, what would you answer to that question if someone would ask you, how do you find restorative justice in the context, of course, of violent radicalization and extremist harms?
Thank you. Well, it is hard to say. Restorative justice takes many forms, uses different methods, and operates across a wide range of contexts. It was a bottom-up process through participatory models, first applied in the juvenile justice system, and from there it has expanded to adult world. And there it faced new and complex challenges from serious violent crimes to environmental crimes, from corporate crimes to crimes related to processes of radicalization and extremism. The last one, according to me, is a very demanding field because of the criminological complexity of radicalization itself. So in this context, if we want to answer to your question, we must consider issues such as culturally motivated crimes, criminal subcultures, and the individual varying sensitivity to the threat of punishment, but also to justice. What is justice above all? All these elements remind us that criminal intervention, as Professor Gavrielides said, cannot simply adjust or modify the severity of sanctions. That's the reason for we need restorative justice. We need other paradigms. We need broader strategies capable of looking beyond the boundaries of criminal law and engaging other fields of knowledge. So in that perspective, I mean, in the perspective of radicalization, restorative justice represents an attempt to heal the fracture between therapy, correction, ethics, responsibility, well-being. So this is the reason for it is not a model only to prevent radicalization, but to foster a reconciliation with life, with the awareness of being human beings. So in short, I think we don't need a new definition of restorative justice. What we really need is a full understanding of its potential, its limits, of course, and its capacity to engage in dialogue with other epistemological models, including those that inform contemporary criminology, contemporary sociology, but also the contemporary dimension of justice in the wider horizon of human rights.
I think the two previous speakers, they were spot on, giving really good examples, but for our sake, it's a paradox that we do not work with the restorative justice angle in terms of terrorist offenders. On the other hand, it has been so difficult to try to think of that in terms of our terrorist offenders, because we do have the 22nd July terrorists incarcerated. And, you know, a guy that killed 77 people, many of them children. So for other types of crimes, it's way easier to think about restorative justice. And as I tried to say initially, we do that at a certain stage, but for mainly for youths that do not serve time in prisons per se, but they go through an alternative sanctioning system. We have a lot of individual stories that you may say that this is part of a restorative justice narrative, also among terrorist offenders, but it's not within the framework of restorative justice per se, as they are not, you know, it's not in the system, it is not a formal program, etc. There are certain opportunities, but I also fear that there are a lot of obstacles doing this in Norway, not least because of the terrorists I just mentioned. We also have the form of terrorism that we have experienced is, yes, we have a couple of direct terrorist attacks, but we also have the majority of terrorist convictions relate to Syria, where we cannot actually say that there is a burning gun here. There is where we have specific victims, because we criminalized just going to Syria a few years ago. So who are the victims really? And that actually opens up for some interesting debate, because I would argue that well, perhaps communities are victims.
Because I didn't, so I will be brief also, but just to say what I think it is important. So our work in the Basque country has been, because this was quite an anomaly in Europe. We have been in the Basque country suffering quite severe forms of terrorism and political violence during decades when it was absolutely done in Europe. Then come another form of terrorism that we have also suffered, and with the trains in Madrid in 2004. But I like to say that our restorative justice, we are talking about very severe victimization, in prison, and they start with a literature workshop run by inmates that start somehow empathizing with victims. And they wanted to meet the victims. And some victims said yes. And it was the first program that started at the end of 2010 in the Spanish prisons. So the first program was with terrorism, political violence, violent extremism, contextualized for the case of the Basque country. And this was and applying restorative justice to other crimes and to other people that were sentenced in prisons for other kind of victimizations, and also to jihadist terrorism. And I like just also to say that this makes sense. Why? It makes sense in prison because we are talking about, in this case, the murder of a lot of people, of severe victimization. So it takes time. And it's complementary in that sense. We need the criminal justice system to say what it is not, to have guarantees during a court proceeding, to respond to terrorism with counter-terrorism policies that respect human rights. This is very important. Otherwise, violence contaminates us. And in this case, because political violence and radical extremism dehumanize, transform people into objects for a message, to make politics through violence, to impose our ideologies, our ideas through violence. Violent extremism, violent radicalization is a monologue. It's the monologue of violence that contaminates us, that provokes more violence by the state or by other groups in a sort of competitive victimhood, who suffer the first, who suffer most. And in that sense, I'd like to define restorative justice as a dialogue. It's not the monologue. It's a response that is based on dialogue, facing the monologue of violence that involves justice in the form of active accountability, healing, but also joint learning. And it approaches not only individual harms, but also social harms. And the social harm is the repression of political and ideological pluralism that is the core and the best of our imperfect democracies. Thank you.
Gemma's point about the limitations of restorative justice and how we were taught that this is where we stop and this is where we begin. It's a very important one, which in fact the recent literature and research supports that the more complex the case is, the more success restorative justice has. And though this is a no-brainer, people just don't understand it. So they would direct the restorative justice to low-level crimes and juvenile offenders. But the more investment there is in the harm, the more complex the harm is, the more genuine and painful the process will be, so that the outcome is more genuine and more impactful. And this is one of the areas where restorative justice can make a difference, when there is complexity in the harm, when there is hate and the dialogue takes place, and then the barriers of misunderstanding starts to collapse. So that's one important point that I wanted to reinforce. And then the other one that, again, was made about victims were originally very defensive about restorative justice. The victimology field was very skeptical, like is the gender field. But we're now coming to terms that actually restorative justice is about giving voice to those who the criminal justice system tends to neglect. And that if it's done properly and it gives voice equally, then at least if the outcome is not what all parties want, at least everybody has had the chance to be listened to. And that is very important for violence such as domestic violence, gender-based violence, where parties tend to be silenced, victims tend to be silenced, and there is this constant power abuse that keeps them silent. And restorative justice can give them voice, may not repair, but it will give them voice. And that's another side effect, if you like, of restorative justice. The final point I wanted to reinforce is what Grazia said about partnerships. And the model And if success is going to be found in restorative justice and extremism, is through partnerships. You know, I combine from psychology, positive psychology, art, sports, everything. That's not restorative justice. That's different fields. It's from sports to social sciences to psychology, applied sciences, and so on. If restorativists think that we can do it alone, you know, we're wrong. Lawyers cannot do it alone. But it's about how you build those partnerships. And as long as that intention is there, I think then we can understand that it's a holistic issue. It's not an issue that we can deal with one approach.
Thank you so much, and many congratulations on your book. We're looking forward to going through it in more detail. I did put a question because you, I think, wrote something really useful provocation. I think for anybody involved in academic writing, you also refer to great swathes of the media in TV and radio and elsewhere as, and here's the quote, generating trauma. So that's, I think, both sobering and an important corrective for many of us who are, as it were, doing our best, however imperfectly. So I'm really interested in that. To think, are you getting it? Should we be looking for something like a more restorative approach to storytelling? And if so, what might that look or feel like? Have you got any good examples or any? Because the critique is very, very strong. So where would you like to see that going?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key success elements, especially for this particular complex nature of harm, to cause that, but with care and with responsibility. And that's very, very important for restorative justice. And that's where the partnerships are important, because restorative justice practitioners are no therapists, are no psychologists. And when we trigger that trauma through storytelling, and I'll give you an example, then we need to be prepared to pick up the pieces, because we're intentionally doing that. Now, the justification for that is that we are doing it to repair. We're doing it to repair that connection that we already have and that we already harmed because of what happened. And that's the justification for causing that trauma through our storytelling, through art, through our dialogue.
And maybe I would also like something to add before we maybe go ahead, because I think it's, of course, definitely it's the relationship, but also what brings a good relationship, what is a good relationship. And I think you've been speaking already around it, Theo, as you said, like you feel drained, you felt heavy when actually working with these individuals. And I think it's empathy. And empathy is working with, and I think it doesn't matter. I do also work for more than 8 years in prison. And when I see also my clients and someone is really seeing that you have an interest as a human being, whatever happened before, and whatever also might happen, or whatever is in the end of the program, the training, whatever you do with this individual, but you just give yourself as a human being, show interest and also empathy. That is for me then really the key point of also a good relationship, meaning whatever relationship it is, but as soon as they see you really interested in this individual, I think that is a great foundation of really making a change. And that is also sometimes a bias when you are a practitioner working in that field, have a lot of empathy. I mean, everyone who's working actually with persons on a very close base every day, that comes with this, also responsibility. So of course you do feel heavy listening to all these stories, but I find that very revealing, and sometimes I'm grateful through that, because it shows me on one side which kind of good life I have, and on the other side also to know with giving yourself an empathy through the ones you're working with, you can really make the change. And I just wanted to kind of pick this up because this is a feeling you described, Theo, I know very well. And maybe just go ahead, because I think it's also an important topic about values and maybe also emotions, like in this field.
everyone was basically, as we're talking about the definition of restorative justice, what was reverberating was emotion, feeling. And Theo several times said, I felt connected to people. But interestingly, what was not flashed out, and maybe that is something we can do in the future a bit more, is what are the roles of emotions? What are the roles of feelings that are generated in certain contexts? And what are the cultural modulations, say shame, hate, fear? And I think these are paramount if you want to talk about restorative justice and move on, because from the way I understand it, it's a deeply relational concept.
In terms of what you said about emotions, restorative justice is relational. It's the beginning and the end. This is why I said, it exercises power itself, and it exercises pain in a different type of pain. But the justification, the moral justification of restorative justice is found precisely in the relational aspect of restorative justice. Why? Because you and I were connected. That is the assumption. We were never met, but we are connected. We are human beings. We are connected through our humanity. Something happens and disrupts this connection, the harm, whatever, right? Restorative justice comes in to intervene so that disconnection is fixed. That process is the painful process that I explained. And the justification for that pain that we are going through is this repair, is this relational aspect of restorative justice. And what a wonderful thing to repair. We're not trying to be materialistic here. We're not, yes, you might end up getting all sorts of other things. But the focus of restorative justice is not to name, is not to turn onto the individual and say, you're an offender, you did this, you're a victim, you need to get that. No, the focus is on the repair of the harm and of our relationship, and seeing everybody who is involved through the same lenses. That's why we don't differentiate victims, offenders. That's why at the beginning, the victims movement was very skeptical, because it was like, oh, where is my title as a victim? Where is my victim's rights? Where is my victim's code? Where is my victim's laws? They're not taking away, they're still there. Human rights is the foundation of restorative justice. What restorative justice does is shift the focus from being an individual responsibility to being a focus on repairing harm and focusing on what the relationship is. So it's at the heart. If you miss that, then you don't get restorative justice. It's so deeply relational. Susan Sharp wrote a lot about the relational aspects of restorative justice.
So I'm interested to hear from any of the panelists whether the approach, if one had to hone in on it in terms of restorative justice, would be a person-to-person approach or something that's more systemic. And I understand that the aim is for both, but where you feel the most value is in terms of radicalization and extremism.
Yeah, if I may, I think it's a very interesting question, because many times restorative justice has been seen, now there is this some kind of, I wouldn't say confrontation, but in terms of innovative justice, some groups, particularly coming from feminist groups, prefer to talk of transformative justice instead of restorative justice, in the sense that what we want to do is transform and question the conditions that enable the harm. Which are those conditions, to change so that it does not happen again, or it's more difficult to happen again. So, and sometimes restorative justice by groups of victims coming from anti-discrimination movements, or victims of hate crime or violent extremism, they think of restorative justice as a justice that can banalize or be some kind of privatization of conflicts that involve a serious social harm in those terms. And I think we can question that very much because of what has been explained by Theo in his book and the panelists and also the intervention by people who are participating today, that there is a community, there is an involvement of the community, and it's also that social harm. So I do think that it's important because particularly in hate crime, so I'll make that difference between hate crime and violent extremism that can involve political violence, if so, in its many forms. I think it is important because in hate crime, it is really the target of victimization. It's a group of people that are discriminated in society. So, I mean, it's society, the one that has to take the responsibility to change that. And this is very important because it's not only the role of the individual offender, the role of the harm doer, or whatever term we want to use it. It is the responsibility of the whole of the society, and in particular, some institutions that provoke secondary victimization, not only the first victimization, but also secondary victimization in the way they treat offenders and in the way they treat victims as well.
For me, everything begins with trust. Trust is the pivotal term because we have inherited distrust. So when we speak about method, a systemic approach or a person-to-person approach, I think we should follow the path of trust. What better builds trust among people? Of course, in Italy, we have a systemic approach that try to overcome what we have inherited from the so-called Black pedagogy. I'm referring to authoritarian punitive model of education deeply rooted in Western culture, which for centuries justified violence as a tool of education, learning, but also the violence of punishment. Now we need something else, something more. We have to break the chain of educational violence that characterize Black pedagogy and must recover, and we must, discover new ways which embrace many aspects of life. As Theo Gavrielides said, art, sports, they are human dimension of lives. So it's very hard to opt for systemic methods or more bottom-up methods. I think that a systemic approach may face some challenges. For example, we have cross-border victims, but also cross-border perpetrators, and we have too much rules that govern restorative justice. In the perspective of radicalization, I think that an approach that is built in the community may work much better than a systemic approach we can implement in the face of the enforcement of punishment. We need something different to engage people, which is very demanding, very challenging, and offer them trust in participating into a restorative justice program. For me, everything begins with trust. Trust is the pivotal term because we have inherited distrust. So when we speak about method, a systemic approach or a person-to-person approach, I think we should follow the path of trust. What better builds trust among people?
Emma from Simon Chambers, what are the current priorities to enable the increased use of the restorative justice in national criminal justice system? Difficult to generalize, of course, but it would be interesting to hear speakers' view on what needs to happen now.
Just say that there is a lot going on at the European level, as you know, but also wider levels at the UN level and OSCE as well. So there's definitely a lot of movement from those international players to promote restorative justice. I think I shared with some of you that OSCE asked me to prepare a practical guide for restorative justice in hate violence and extremism, and I've done that, and hopefully it will be presented to the high-level group of the EU very soon and will be published. So there's definitely some sort of movement at a European-wide level to promote restorative justice. Here in the UK, we are now involved in a youth justice system evidence-based gathering to see if it's going to work out for all youth offending teams as an approach, as a consistent approach. The fear that I have, which I shared before when the question about rolling it out, is whether we are prepared as a movement or as a field to absorb any responsibility and any casework that then will start coming to us. Because in all honesty, I hear about people talking about restorative justice, but I rarely find practitioners and people doing restorative justice. So my fear, Simon, is not whether the policy people are buying into restorative justice. I think we have enough directives, enough recommendations, books, guidance, laws, loads of things. My fear is whether we have enough practitioners around and whether we have enough organizations that are going to absorb, because if they're going to be done by the same people who are not trained, or the people who are not qualified to do restorative justice, then I prefer that we don't, that we get ourselves ready first, and that we are prepared to do that.
So from an international perspective, what transferable elements of restorative practice travels well and which must always be locally adapted? What do you think, Theo, also? Which are like universal and which are not that universal to use?
Yeah, and I think, again, the adaptability of restorative justice, and I know Gemma done quite a lot of international stuff as well, the European level as well. I think the adaptability of restorative justice to be a very specific form of justice at the local level for the individuals, but also at the same time, it was the foundations for the truth and reconciliation committees. What happened in Rwanda with the Kagaga forms of justice, and in South Africa, it can take more international dimension, and it can also repair relationships that impact on communities and impact interstate conflicts. And that is, we have examples. John Braithwaite wrote a lot about this. He's got loads of stuff on his website about peace building and using restorative justice at that international kind of dimension level, which doesn't take away the very small project level in a kitchen that also makes a huge difference. I think if you focus too much on replicating, let's say, the recipe of 4 eggs, 1 cup of milk, and 1 cup of flour, and you make a cake, you will fail with restorative justice. That's not how you should think of restorative justice. Restorative justice, it's about, as you said, about relationships and about values. And if we prescribe it, that's why I have been concerned about prescribed ways of doing restorative justice and about registers and about standardizing. Jerry Johnstone talk a lot about standardization of restorative justice. Then you will remove the heart of the community and the heart of restorative justice. Stick to the values, stick to the essence, stick to the relationships, and allow the communities to adapt it. And then you will have some good results from restorative justice. Try and standardize it and control it, then you will be enforcing the same power dynamics that the criminal justice system is enforcing.
Okay, thank you. So we're going kind of back, I like that, what you said before, to the main heart of emotions and relationships. about the possible successful outcomes of restorative justice in addressing violent radicalization. Do you think that this process can also be adapted to the violent offenders suffering mental illness who sometimes are not even aware of the harm they have caused to others? That's also, I guess, interesting one. Yeah.
Yeah, so we run a different project specifically for mental health, two of them actually. And as you know, art is used a lot within the mental health context. So therapy uses art a lot. So we tapped into that and we use restorative justice in mental health settings. There's also an academic who works in the NHS here, and he's done quite a lot on using restorative justice with mental health patients, and has showed quite important results. And I would say that therapy combined with restorative justice and art have shown to show a great potential, especially around issues of trauma and healing, artistic expressions of healing, basically through through those indirect ways of dialogue and expressions of emotions. And that artistic expression doesn't need to be in one form. We have seen it in music, poetry, just designs, you name it. It's up to the individual to choose that vehicle. But yeah, art and mental health and restorative justice has been one of the areas that we have explored and has huge potential. But at the same time, as I said, if there is no qualified therapists and psychologists and psychotherapists, because it's a very tricky area, it can cause damage, and it has to be done extremely carefully and within the right settings.
Okay, thank you. Maybe also another question is like, maybe one key risk of applying restorative approaches to extremist harm. What could it be? Are there also, I mean, we heard a lot of, okay, how useful it is, but also sometimes we have to like talk about the other sides, like the negative sides. And what could it be, especially in the topic also of your book and going back to this of extremist harm and radicalization or extremism in general?
Yeah, I mean, everybody, I think, has spoken about this, that practice needs to be a good practice and the facilitation needs to be good practice. So moving beyond the quality of restorative justice, I think something to bear in mind when it comes to complex cases, so hate and violent radicalization and terrorism in particular, they involve very strong emotions and very deep-rooted thoughts and feelings about each other, which are the consequences of the them and I narrative, of the fear that is created, and that is perpetuated over years. It's not the outcome of one day of results. So if there is no specific focus and training and background so that the practitioner can pick up the pieces, because you will open the Pandora box, then it will end up doing damage and it will end up causing harm when we're talking about the control side of things. If we're talking about the prevention side of things and we are trying to raise awareness in schools, universities, different educational institutions, the society, again, how you use the language so that we don't backfire and acknowledge everybody's concerns in communities that are now sometimes even deeply divided because of this narrative. If we fail to communicate, then again, it can cause friction. It can cause, oh, you're letting people off the hook. Oh, you're not taking this seriously. Oh, you're not listening to me. And that can create more harm than what we are intending to do. But yeah, I'll stop there. Maybe there are a few minutes that left if the panelists get a chance to say something. And I just want to leave kind of the last concluding thoughts, if I may, and just say thank you before everybody says their last word.
So as we heard to the three panelists, what are your final, not words, of course, but maybe thoughts, or how would you wrap up today this 2.5 hours and the discussion we had.
Okay, very briefly, I'd like to say something which is a very basic principle, and I think it's very well reflected in the book by Theo, and it's the humanity principle, violence. So what does violence do to us, and what can we do with violence? How can we respond? So violence dehumanizes. Sometimes responses to violence dehumanize. And I think that restorative justice with its risk is not the panacea, it's not just, the horizon that is quite simple and superficial. It's a very complex things for complex harms. And I think what it does is humanize, which is very difficult. Entails a lot of work and entails personal, institutional, and social efforts in a never-ending enterprise, like the Sisyphus myth, also very well explained by Camille. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, it's very difficult to sum up. It was very, very interesting to listen all the participants and the questions and answers. What can I say? Let's start with this observation. Extremism can lead to the polarization of debate. Violence calls other violence. And working on radicalization and extremism means, according to me, avoiding polarization and finding questions that build bridge of dialogue. We must build bridges, and we can do it if we bear in mind that restorative justice is not a softer justice, but it is a deeper one. If we think that restorative justice does not reduce punishment or may not reduce punishment, but it expands the meaning of mutual responsibility. And restorative justice doesn't take away the symbolic meaning of justice, but it brings back the meaning of justice into human relationship. So I think that, as Theo said, justice can truly contribute to peace, and it can do it when it becomes an experience of dialogue at different levels of dialogue and mutual recognition. It's not the peace of silence and control and of repression, but it is a sort of a demanding peace, a very difficult peace to reach, of coexistence, open to restoring, but before that, open to create the condition for just relationship. Sometimes we have not to repair, but we have to build, co-design, and co-create the condition for mutual and just relationships. Okay. Well, it's very difficult to sum up. It was very, very interesting to listen all the participants and the questions and answers. What can I say? Let's start with this observation. Extremism can lead to the polarization of debate. Violence calls other violence. And working on radical.
Well, from my humble perspective, this has been a great learning experience, and also looking through Theo's book, it's good to see that a lot of the stuff that we do in a correctional service is actually within the framework, but it's not as explicit. So I think that for us, somebody like, for our sake in the correctional service, it's I took a learning in what Theo said, that you should take care if you talk about it as a systemic way of being enforced. So there are really good lessons to be learned from these discussions, as well as Theo's excellent book.
I just want to make a personal note, and I think those who know me are finding it hard not to make personal connections with everything I do and write, with my own life and how I feel. And I think that's what restorative justice should be, to allow us to be vulnerable. And when we are vulnerable and human beings, then we have the ability to connect. And if we can't do that, then I think we need to think before we say we're going to do restorative justice. So just starting from that, just to say thank you to all of the panelists who agreed to support this event today and speak, and for supporting the work. It means a lot to me. And also a huge thanks to my team. Thank you, Rita, for sorting out all the technical stuff. She's been my right hand for 10 years. I've got an amazing team. I'm just so proud to have so many people supporting my vision. And I feel very privileged, and I get inspired and motivated to do what I'm doing because of my human connections and relationships. So, we talked a lot about relationships, but we also need to put it in the context of our own reasons of why we're doing this. And as I said in my first slide, I can't think of a world that measures justice by how many people we put behind bars. I want to measure success and how well we've progressed as humanity with how much we heal and how much we repair, know how much we punish and put people away. And if we can all work together to make that happen, then that's a good message to send as a conclusion of this conference. And if anyone doesn't know us yet, or doesn't know RJ for All, then this is an open invitation to join us and find out more and start working together. So beginning of the journey together. And those who already know us, let's strengthen the relationships and work more and more intensely on ideas that you have and join our expertise. So on that note, I just want to say a huge thank you for staying until the end. I know in Europe is 1 hour ahead, so it's 7:30 for you. So I really appreciate you spending the time with me and with RJ for All and supporting the work that we do. It means a lot to me on a personal note, but also as RJ for All's director.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And also from my side, thank you for everyone who is still in the room and for the great discussion, to the panelists, Grazia, Gemma, and David, and that really fruitful conversation. And in the end, and that's great, it's always when we do work with people, when we do believe in being better also as communities or societies, it's about relationships and emotions. And I'm there with this. And I wish you all a wonderful, wherever you are, day, evening, night, and have a good one and take care. Thank you.